Perfect. Hello, everyone. We're just a minute to 2 o'clock here, and that's my time here in Toronto, but just thanks for joining. We'll just start in a minute or two, just letting folks join in. Thanks so much, and nice to see everyone. Nice to see some folks joining us today. Thank you again to those just signing in. We'll start in just a minute or so. Hello again. Thank you for joining. I see some more folks joining in. I see we're just about a minute past, so we'll get started in about a second or two. Give Rebecca enough time for a great presentation today. So thanks everyone for joining. All right. So I think we should be okay to get started here. And thanks again to everyone joining today. Okay, so let's just dive right in. So for anyone who hasn't connected with us before, hasn't joined us for a webinar, or if you already know me, regardless, my name is Hannah Holmes, pronouns she and her, and I'm the program director at PLEAC, the Public Legal Education Association of Canada. So in the spirit of reconciliation, I do acknowledge that I am located here in Toronto, Ontario, on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I also actually want to add today that November is Indigenous Education Month here in Toronto, specifically in the Toronto District School Board. So this month is an important reminder to center First Nations, Métis, and Inuit perspectives, voices, histories, and contemporary realities, and to keep in mind generally the opportunity to learn from Indigenous perspectives on treaties, Indigenous leadership, achievements, resurgence, and creativity as well. So just a few reminders just about that if you are located here in Toronto, and to just consider that as well if you are elsewhere in Canada here. So today, I'm very excited to hear from our speaker, Rebecca Shore, Senior Plain Language Specialist at Éducaloi, who will be sharing some tips for translating legal information clearly and accurately. This is an area that comes up a lot in conversation, actually, so I'm very sure that many of you will be interested to hear in Rebecca in just a moment. So I will quickly remind everyone that this session is recorded and it will be uploaded to our website after today. So there will also be a very brief survey at the end of the webinar, so just take a minute to complete it whenever you can. You can also, interact with us during the webinar. We really strongly encourage you to ask any questions that come up that are top of mind. As you listen today, you can use the chat function, you can use the Q&A function, and Rebecca will gladly get to as many of your questions as they can, either during, if it's sort of something more pressing, or we can save some time afterwards as well, which we will have some time at the end. So enough for me. Without further ado, I will pass it over to Rebecca. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hannah. So yeah, I'm Rebecca, pronouns they, them, and I am a senior plain language specialist at Éducaloi. Éducaloi is a nonprofit whose mission is to explain the law clearly to Quebecers in language that is easy to understand, and also to build their legal skills to navigate legal situations that they're going to encounter in everyday life. So our dual expertise is legal information and legal education. communication. And we're having our 25th anniversary in February. So lots going on for that if you want to check out our website for more information. And we serve a variety of publics with a variety of tools, including English-speaking communities in Quebec, which are a minority language community here, but obviously part of the majority language population of Canada. So that's an interesting context in which to be translating. And a lot of our stuff is on our website. We also do workshops, a variety of different formats and tools. So again, you can check us out at educaloi.qc.ca to see what we do. And almost everything that we do is available in both French and English. So we have part of the team that works in English. Sometimes that involves creating content in English, but a lot of the time that involves translating content that was created in French into English because French is the majority language in Quebec. So the majority of our team works in French. Um, and so today I'm going to give you some tips for translating legal information clearly and accurately based on my experience. I've been at Éducaloi for about 2.5 years, doing translation work during that time. Previously, I had done some translation, but I don't have a formal education in translation. One person on our team does, but the majority do not. So this is really based on our experience, our internal guidelines, with a focus on clear legal communication, obviously, since that is our mission and our expertise. So, again, yeah, don't hesitate to ask your questions in the chat or in the Q&A throughout. I'll be able to see them as I'm going along. So if it's something that I can respond to as I'm talking, I will. If not, we'll be sure to come back to the rest of the questions at the end of my presentation. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is that it's about more than translating, it's about adapting. And this is something that comes from clear communication. The idea that if we're going to communicate clearly, we have to know our target audience and we have to adapt to them. So one sort of interesting case that I wanted to open with is cultural references. So, for example, we had a idea for a legal news item that was going to talk about Christmas time. You want to sing Christmas songs, but what about copyright? So that led to a very interesting situation that we had to navigate in both languages because the cultural references, the songs in both languages are not the same. So, starting with the title for our little legal news item about Christmas carols and copyright, the French was Vive le vent légal. Vive le vent is jingle bells. Vive le vent, vive le vent, vive le vent. Légal was kind of the play on words that the French team came up with. And then we on the English team had to figure out what to do with that. So, you know, maybe the most direct translation would have been jingle legal bells. Doesn't quite have the same ring to it. You might agree. So, you know, it shows that we have some latitude on the English side to find something that works in English that achieves the same goal, maybe slightly differently. So, in this case, the person who is translating into English felt that deck the halls legally was an option that worked fairly well and communicated the idea of having a play on words with the title of A Christmas Carol and the idea of what's legal somewhere in there in the title. A couple more examples from that article that I wanted to talk about. Again, it was written originally in French and then it was something that we had to translate into English. So, all of the examples that were being used for Christmas songs in the French version, we had to figure out how we wanted to adapt that into the English version. So, I don't know if anyone knows Le Temps d'une Dinde de Roland Higa Tremblay. I did not, but it's a very popular Francophone Christmas carol in Quebec. And so on our end, we just kind of went with something that had, you know, maybe a bit of a similar vibe, but not even really, just like think of a popular English language Christmas carol that we wanted to use as an example instead, and we went with Rocking Around the Christmas Tree. Of course, some of them do exist in both languages, and depending on the context, it was possible to just do the same in both languages. So, Douce Nuit, Sainte Nuit is Silent Night. So we were able to do that. Adeste Fidelis is actually O Come, Come All Ye Faithful, which does exist in English as well. But I wanted to raise this example because one thing we try to be mindful of as well is cultural references, particularly references that focus on Christianity. And we try not to have too many of them, and we try to have a variety of cultural references that are inclusive of other religions or aren't specific to one religion. So I noticed that in this case, even though Come All Ye Faithful exists in English and we could have translated that, we went with Deck the Halls, maybe partly because that was something that came up in the title of our article, but maybe partly also because we already had Silent Night. So maybe we didn't want to add another um, religious carol. We wanted to just kind of limit references to Christianity repeatedly. And then finally, that article ended with a reference to Marine Marchand, des Cowboys Fringants. I don't know if anyone knows that Quebecois band. And in our case, in English, it looks like the person who was translating decided that in Quebec, Les Cowboys Fringants, they're well known, they're popular even among English speakers, but maybe not to the level that the titles of individual songs are well known enough for us to be name dropping them. So kept the same idea, but made a small change so that it was more adapted to the English speaking audience. So that's one example that I hope is interesting and useful for understanding some things that we need to be aware of when we're adapting to a different target audience because we're translating something from one language to another. Some other examples are names. You know, again, similar to references to Christianity with names that we're choosing for characters in examples, we try to be mindful of cultural diversity and have names that speak to a variety of different communities so that everyone feels included. Another example that is specific to Quebec, so you can maybe think about some examples that might be specific to your context, but the word national in Quebec, we have to be mindful of the fact that in French, national really means provincial. It means Quebec-wide. If someone's going to be talking about something that's Canada-wide in French in Quebec, they're going to say Canadien instead of national. So, but in English, national, most English speakers think of Canada-wide Canadian when they hear the word national, even if they're living in Quebec and even if they've always lived in Quebec, the meaning of that word is a bit different for Francophones and for Anglophones. So those are some examples of how translating can also mean having to adapt and keep in mind many cultural things. And it can be more than just simple references. Sometimes we really have to ask ourselves, is the same information relevant for both of these target audiences? And because we keep most of our content up to date, we do have to have pretty much the same information in both languages, just so that it's feasible for us to keep everything up to date. If we had things only existing in one language and not the other, it makes everything more complicated. We have a few cases where it's like that, and it is much more complicated. So, in general, we try to have the same information pretty much exactly the same in both languages, but sometimes there's room to slightly change or adapt pieces of information if there's something that's relevant to one target audience that's not relevant to the other. For example, language laws in Quebec, there's laws about when French has to be used and when English can be used, and obviously the needs and priorities of people looking for content about those laws is going to be quite different depending on whether they want to use French, and so maybe are more likely to be looking for French language content about those laws, or if they want to be using English, and so therefore might be more likely to be looking for content in English about those laws. So um, that was something that was pretty difficult for us to navigate. In the end, we created a lot of content specific to English speaking communities because uh, they were facing restrictions. They had a lot of concerns and fears and misunderstandings about that, and we saw a clear need to explain all of that in English. And we translated all of that content into French so that it's available in French, but it is still very much speaking to the needs of the English speaking community, even the version in French. And so maybe in a future time, there will be funding on the French side to think about that issue from the perspective of what does the French speaking communities in Quebec, what do those communities need to know about these language laws? And then we will also potentially translate that information into English. Um, and also referring people to resources. Are resources available in the language that we're translating into? Are they trusted by that community? Because, for example, we refer people to government bodies a lot, but again, the language laws have introduced new restrictions on communicating with Quebec government bodies in English. And so it's kind of tricky if someone was writing in French and referred to a government body as a resource, as we often do in English, then we have to sort of ask the question, okay, how many people reading our content in English are going to actually be able to get service from this government body in English? Are they going to be feel comfortable going to this government body if they need English based on, the laws and how people are feeling about them? And then also, is there anything that we need to explain to them so that they're able to use this resource in English that might be different than using it in French? So that's where things can get a little more complicated. And also just a question of how does information need to be communicated so that it resonates with the audience. That can be a bit different from one language to the other. Based on the way that our workflow is right now, the language that's written in first, things are probably going to be thought of much more from that perspective. So then when people are coming in to translate into that other language, they might see things that the original author didn't see or have other things that they find important. And so, because we do most of our translation internally, we can generally have a conversation about that and see if we can um, work something out that makes sense for both audiences, works in both languages, since we do need to try to keep it as mirrored as possible. And I'll talk more about our workflow and how all of that works a little bit later. But I also wanted to give some more concrete, straightforward tips about translating legal information clearly and accurately because it's definitely a challenge. Um, and I think there's a few reasons for that. The civil law is much more adapted for French. The common law is much more adapted for English. In Quebec, in our situation, we have to be translating civil law concepts into English. And then in other jurisdictions, you that are all here today to listen, you are very likely in common law jurisdictions and maybe thinking about having to translate things into French. I recognize there are also likely other organizations here today who are from Quebec, so you're more in our situation. But there is the other situation of common law and French versus our situation of civil law and English. So, talking about civil law or common law in the language that it was not conceived in is definitely tricky. So, when choosing terms, there are a variety of different factors that need to be balanced. So, for us, we tend to look at about three considerations. So, I mean, number one, we check to see if the law has an official translation in the language that we want to translate into. That always gives us a place to start, but that doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to stay there and stick with the term that's in the law. The way that we make that decision is usually to think about, okay, this official term in the law, this official translation of this legal term that exists in the law, is it easy to understand? If someone sees this term Is it pretty intuitive? Is it pretty likely that they sort of have an idea of what that means just by reading it on its own? Is it a term that people come across often? Because part of understanding is familiarity. So even if there is a term that is a bit jargony on its face, if it's a term that's often used in the media, elsewhere, people have heard it many times and they've heard it in connection with explanations of what it means and what it means for them, how they're going to interact with it, then that's another reason that maybe it's okay to use a term that sounds kind of like legalese if it's very familiar and very well known and well understood. Another consideration is what are people going to do with the information that we're going to give them? Because we are kind of like a first step. We give general information that gives someone a base to better understand the information that's relevant to be able to navigate their situation. But there's going to be many more steps for them to actually navigate that situation after they've read and understood the information that we've given them. So we kind of have to keep that in mind in the sense that in the next steps that this person is going to take, are they going to be confronted by this legal term? If that's likely, then we should probably explain it now, clearly, and then they're better set up to take those next steps. And when, for example, they're coming into contact with the court system and there's a legal term that the court system is using, better that they hear it for the first time in our content than to hear it for the first time when they're trying to, work with the courts and make something happen. So those are all reasons why we might choose to go with the official term in the law and make sure that we include like a plain language explanation of what exactly that means. But sometimes we might decide that we're going to use a different term than the term that is in the law. And again, it's really just trying to think about the context. So, is the official term like, is it too legalese, too jargony? In our opinion, we think that someone's going to look at that and they're immediately eyes glaze over, turn off, like, I can't engage with that word. Possibly. Is it too close to the French? Because often with official translations for laws, um, we see translations that stick very close to the French. And so that can also be kind of alienating for an English speaking audience to have a word that doesn't really work that way in English or mean that thing in English. It was chosen because it matches most closely to the French. Um, and so in that case, if we have some concerns about, whether the official term is going to resonate with the people that we're trying to talk to, then we need to think about, is there another option that people use much more often? So in this area, for this issue, if I'm talking to my friends or my family or people on the street, like what's the word that people are using to talk about this legal issue casually, regularly amongst themselves? And if we can find another option that people use much more often, then the question is, okay, if we decide to go with this other term because we find that it's more familiar, it's more commonly understood, it's easier to understand than the official term in the law. What's the person going to do next? Again, to go back to, okay, we're the first step, we're giving people some basic information. What's their next step? And we need to just make sure that there's limited or no risk to using a different term than the one that's in the law. Maybe it's a situation where along their next steps. It's such that they'll keep coming across this other term that we've decided to use, or it's such that when they come across the official term in the law, it's easy to make the connection to the word that they already know, and it's going to be fine. So that's some of the theory, but I will say that actually, in most cases, we cover all of our bases by mentioning whatever term we didn't choose once near the beginning to make sure that all of them have been said and we've done the work to explain to people that these things, it all means the same thing. It's all good. So I'm going to give some examples because I think that will make it more concrete. But the reason we only say it once is a principle of clear communication is to use the same term to mean the same thing all the time. So it wouldn't be a good idea for us to switch back and forth between the official term in the law and a different term that we've chosen. We try to make a consistent choice overall, but then to mention at least once at the beginning, okay, this is the term that we're using, this is what it means. You might also see this other term, and that means the same thing. And then we've just kind of gotten that issue out of the way, and then we can go along and use the term that we feel is clearer, easier to understand, and is the better choice for our target audience, whether that be the official term in the law or a different term. So, an example is succession and estate. The official term in civil law is succession. It's succession in French, which is translated as succession in English in the Quebec Civil Code. So that is the official term that's used in the law, succession. But we find that most English speakers are more familiar with the word estate. Even if they live in Quebec, they've always lived in Quebec. Estate is just the term that is much more commonly used and understood in English. Now, you could argue that estate is common law terminology, meaning that it doesn't technically apply in Quebec. So, that's a consideration. That's something to keep in mind that legally speaking, it's maybe not the most accurate term for Quebec, but is it a term that helps people understand what we're talking about? Because we have a lot of content about estates, wills, estates, successions, what happens after a person dies and everything that has to be dealt with. And typically, we're going to be referring back to that term very often if that's the main topic of a piece of content. So we want to use a word that people aren't going to get stuck on every time that we say it. We want to use a word that people already know that, you know, is going to streamline their reading comprehension, all of that. So that is why in most cases, I mean, overall, we have made the decision to use estate in English in our content and to say at least once that, the official term that's used in Quebec is succession, but you've probably heard the word estate. And so throughout our content, we're going to talk about dealing with an estate. But just know that here in Quebec, it's called a succession. And at the end of the day, like in terms of risk, that's a situation where you think about it and you're like, okay, if someone's trying to find information about how to deal with things after someone has died, using a term that they already know is maybe going to be a better experience for them at this first step where they're really stressed out. They're just trying to figure out what's going on. They just need the basic information. So, using a term that they already know is going to be helpful for them to just integrate all of that and not get too hung up on little things at the stage of the general information that we can provide them. And then as they go along, um, whether they're saying estate, if they're saying estate instead of succession, it's going to be pretty clear pretty quickly, whoever they're dealing with, that what they're talking about is everything that has to be dealt with after a person has died. So if they're using a term that another legal professional might not use, because in Quebec it's called succession, we don't really see it as a barrier or a risk to the legal professional not understanding what they want to deal with. It's kind of like a general term. It's a general concept. It's not super specific. Whereas something like a protection mandate, that's a specific legal document naming someone to take care of you if you're incapacitated. So that's a situation where we might be much more likely to use the official term in the law, like protection mandate, because people need to make sure that when they're asking questions about a document that they want to prepare, they're trying to prepare it themselves, they're asking someone else to prepare it. It's a situation where I feel like it's much more important to use the term that is in the law and that is attached to that specific document that they're looking for. So maybe that's one thing to keep in mind, general concepts versus like specific documents, forms. Um, that's maybe two examples of general concept. Maybe we can use a different term if that's going to make things easier. Specific document, probably better to use the official term that's used by the law and the courts and the government and all of that. In terms of validating our choices, obviously testing with the target audience is one of the best things you can do. You know, you have an idea of what you think is right, then you show it to people who are going to use it and you ask them to just kind of go through it and comment on uh, how they're using the document, things they don't understand, questions that it brings up for them. That's kind of the best thing that you can do to kind of validate your choices. But otherwise, there are resources like Termium. We do check that sometimes. Not necessarily legal terms. It's very common law focused, so it's maybe, you know, something that we have to use a little more critically, but maybe in common law jurisdictions, you could rely on that and get much more use out of that. Another option is Google Ngram Viewer. I don't know if any of you are aware or use that, but basically, it's a way to track the number of times that a word or a phrase has been used in books that Google Books has access to over time. It gives you like a graph of like usage of that word. So sometimes I use that if there's like multiple terms that I'm considering and I want to just kind of verify, okay, I think that this term is going to be much more commonly used in English, but I'm not sure. Sometimes I verify it with Google Ngram Viewer. So, for example, procréation assistée, the official term in the law in Quebec is assisted procreation. I was pretty sure that assisted reproduction is the more commonly used term in English. I used Google Ngram Viewer. That confirmed my intuition. So that's kind of just a little interesting tool to have in your toolbox just to kind of validate things that you're thinking about. And these choices that we make in terms of terminology, we try to keep track of what we've already done to stay consistent across all of our content. Honestly, for the moment, we usually just search our own website to make sure, because we have content on a lot of topics already. So if ever we're doing something on a topic that we've already done stuff on before, sometimes we just check what is already on our website so that we can be consistent in some of these word choices. We would like to have more internal tools to be able to track that sort of thing, but for the moment, that's kind of how we do that, stay consistent across everything. And the last thing that I kind of wanted to bring up is the fact that, like, with clear communication, sometimes you can get away from legal terminology entirely, depending on what we're talking about. So, for example, for contractual liability, extra contractual liability, there's a lot of like legal terms for referring to these kinds of situations, but I mean, primarily these two here, that the average person, liability, whoa, and like contractual, extra contractual, that sounds very like legalese and not very easy to understand. But maybe you can just in a sentence explain what that's all about, a sentence, two sentences. Maybe you can explain the concept in different words that are more commonly used, more easy to understand, and just not have to use the legal term at all. Because for us, really, we're only going to use legal terminology if it's something that the person is going to have to use themselves. So if we can get away from it and just explain something another way that's going to be more useful, we definitely try to do that. So, I do want to talk a little bit about our workflow, our process. So, we translate most things in-house. And it's our plain language specialists like myself that do most of the translations between English and French. So, again, because French is the majority language in Quebec, typically most content is written in French and then translated to English, but it does happen that we create something in English and it has to be translated to French. So it can go both ways, but it mostly goes French to English in our case. And so one plain language specialist, plain language specialist A, writes a piece of content. a second plain language specialist, B, rereads that piece of content and gives that person comments so that they can revise. And then once the first plain language specialist has finalized based on the comments they received from the second, then a third plain language specialist, C, will translate that content into the other language. And like I was saying, often, honestly, like I'm I feel so grateful and fortunate that we translate most things in-house because I really find that trying to translate something into another language really, when you're looking at something and you're looking at it from the perspective of, I want to say the exact same thing, I want it to mean the exact same thing in another language, it just really brings out a lot of questions and nuances that maybe didn't come up in the rereading phase. So we often go back to the person who created the content and have discussions about, okay, did I understand this correctly? Or, okay, if we're going to adapt this to an English speaking audience, this part of it doesn't quite work for these reasons. Can we do something else? So there's like a lot of back and forth all along the process, but translation really is a critical step to sort of bring out all of these nuances and address everything. And then there is someone else who also rereads the translation, whether that be the person who originally created the content in the other language, if they're bilingual, plain language specialist A, or that can be the plain language specialist B that reread the original language that also rereads the translation if they are bilingual. Or sometimes we even have a fourth plain language specialist, D, who joins the process just to reread the translation without having been involved previously. So that's kind of our process. And um, I will say that we do sometimes work with external translators as well. Just wanted to make sure I said everything I wanted to say about translating internally. So externally, we do that as well. So in that case, we'll provide guidelines to an external translator who will then translate and then send it back to us, and we review for accuracy and clarity. And we try to give some feedback to the external translators so that over time we continue to work with the same people. They start to get an idea of what we're looking for, and they also start to learn principles of clear legal communication because that is definitely a different way of writing and translating. It's a different skill. Things like writing things in active voice instead of passive voice, like saying that I missed my deadline instead of the deadline was missed, things like that. And also saying things in as few words as possible, but the right words, the best words for the situation to get the point across. So we have built up like a pool of external translators that we work with repeatedly. And I did want to just give you some ideas for finding external translators if you don't already have that. McGill University has a legal translation graduate diploma program. So the people in that program, some of them are lawyers, but most are not. But it is a graduate diploma program specific to legal translation. So if you're looking for legal translators, that would be a good place to start contacting that program because they often send out, job contract offers to their students or recent graduates. So that's one idea. And then maybe also to just ask other organizations or even government offices if they have any contacts, if they have anyone that they would recommend. That's always a good way to find contacts. And finally, I wanted to talk about translating into languages other than French and English, because that definitely brings added challenges. The added challenge and risk being that I think it's clear from what I've talked about that, clear and accurate legal information, there's a lot of work that goes into that. There's a lot of nuances that need to be addressed in the right way. And so, if we're translating into a language for which we don't have plain language specialists who have sufficient mastery to do the work or even to reread for accuracy and clarity, how do we know that the content in those other languages meets our standards for, you know, being legally accurate and being clear and easy to understand? It's a real challenge. So we've started with a few small projects because there is a huge need for languages other than English and French. We see that and we want to respond to it. And so far, we have been able to make it work with either people in-house having sufficient knowledge of other languages to at least review a translation. Maybe they wouldn't be able to do it themselves, but they can review like an external translation and say, yep, I think that says the right thing. Or even our personal networks, people that we know outside of work, asking them to review something and just let us know, like, do you think it says the same thing in both languages? So that's how we've been doing it so far. And other ideas would be to partner with organizations that serve the community that speaks the language that you're translating into, because maybe they have staff that speak that language if it's the language of a community they serve, or maybe you can partner with them to show the content to their clients, their community, and have them get back to you and let you know if it says the right thing or not. So those are some ideas about how to navigate that. Like I said, so far it's been very small projects. We've done pamphlets with short comics about tenant or employee rights. So we have like a handful of sentences that we're trying to translate, nothing more than that. So that kind of allows us to do it, but to have like a small enough amount of content that it's going to be easy and feasible to ask someone to review it and let us know if it's right or not. And some other added challenges to think about is that, like graphic design, for example, because we're doing comics, it becomes more of an issue. If you're doing a different type of content that's less visual, maybe it would be less of an issue. But like the graphic designer needs to have access to a keyboard in the language that you're translating into, because the graphic designer needs to set all of that text in the right place. And so it's important to have whoever's reviewing review like the final version after everyone, including the graphic designer, has gone through it, because depending on the language, accent placement, line breaks, a variety of other things that can be affected by the graphic design could actually change the meaning of what you're saying or result in like an error in the content or something like that. So that's for text-based content. We've also done workshops in languages other than English and French with an interpreter. So, for example, we partnered with Maison Bleu, an organization that offers holistic accompaniment for pregnant women and young mothers from vulnerable populations. So, it's a super cool organization that brings together medical, psychosocial, legal, and community supports all in one place so that these pregnant women or young mothers can come there and get everything that they need all in one place, all at the same time. So, super cool and a super important partner for us to be able to do workshops for these communities. So we have done that. Basically, we prepare the content in English or French, and then it's an interpreter that's on site that is simultaneously interpreting into another language. And sometimes we've even presented in English, French, and another language all at one time. But the thing with that you have to think about is if it's a 90-minute workshop and you're presenting in three languages, well, you can only plan 30 minutes of content because you have to divide the total time that you have by the number of languages you're trying to present in because you're going to say everything that you say three times. So I know that seems pretty basic, but myself as someone who has prepared for and participated in that experience, I think I can be a little unrealistically optimistic about how much we're going to be able to fit in. And it's also a real challenge because we are used to planning content to fill a certain amount of time. And if you have to divide that content by three, well, what are you going to cut? Those are some really hard decisions to make. So, um, that's another experience that we've tried and plan to do more of, I think, if we're able to. And I've talked about our strategies for making that work. The final thing I wanted to talk about was machine translation. That's definitely a tool that exists and can be useful. I would say for us, we use it as a support. Uh, we, like, for example, as we're translating, I personally, and I know other members of the team find it useful if there's like a turn of phrase that's like particularly French, or there's something that we're just like struggling with. It's nice to have it as a sounding board to be like, okay, well, what does the machine translation suggest to me? And then once I'm looking at that, instead of just a blank page, I have something to kind of like work off of and be like, oh no, like, yes, I like that, or no, I don't like that. And actually, now that I see what I don't like, that gives me an idea of what I could do better. So we find it useful in that way. We are testing to see, for example, using machine translation as like a first pass and then reviewing it. What I have heard so far is that it's looking quite time consuming to review something that has been done fully by machine translation and potentially more frustrating and time consuming than just like doing the translation ourselves. We haven't completed our test of that, so I don't have a final answer about that. But all that to say that typically we use it more as a support, not as a replacement for any part of our process. And it could also be useful as a way to keep track of terms that we have decided to use across all our content, but we haven't set it up that way. And we also have Antidut, which is like a language verification tool, which we use more anyway, that also has that same functionality. So that's kind of where we're at with machine translation. But like I say, we're continuing to test and that could evolve. But particularly when it comes to clear and accurate legal information, there's a lot of experience and expertise that kind of goes into the translation work that we do. And at this point, it doesn't seem like machine translation is there for the type of stuff that we want to do and the level that we want it to be at. So, but you know, definitely something to test for yourselves as well to see what you think about that. I also wanted to mention that I have heard about Weglot from some other PLEAC members, and Weglot is a plugin that translates websites. And so then it can automatically update translations when the content has been changed in one language. We do not use that ourselves. We have not tried it, but I have heard that other PLEAC members have tried it. So that is maybe one other tool for you to check out. So I see that Hannah has been putting some of the resources in the chat as I've been going along. Thank you so much, Hannah. I might just go back through my notes and see if there's any other ones that I can add for you. And then that was kind of what I had prepared to present, and I would be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was amazing, and I was feverishly trying to make sure I got all the links and then really helpful resources there. So yeah, we have some time for questions, and I do see one here in the Q&A that I can read out loud here. So hi, do you know of a program in Canada for legal translation in Spanish? I have not been able to
Mm,
find one specifically for the language.
that is a good question. I am not either aware. I can check uh McGill's program, but I'm pretty sure that it's English, French, as far as I know. Um, I'm just adding
Oh, perfect.
termium. Oh, and I sent that to hosts and panelists instead of everyone. I can redo that.
Yeah. There.
There we go. Okay, I've just added termium to the chat, and I'm just going to open uh, the graduate diploma in legal studies just to see
And just
if
so
it mentions the possibility of adding other languages.
Yeah, and just so everyone
Mhm.
knows, Rebecca, while you're looking, I can send these links in a follow-up email as well, just so everyone has them. So uh,
Mm,
there's that.
thank you. Yeah, it is a very good question. And unfortunately, I am not either personally aware of any programs in Spanish.
And yeah, so I mean, if anything kind of comes to mind, even on my end or afterwards, we can send it in a follow-up email. But thank you for the question. There
Hmm.
are so many languages sort of to consider. Which on that note, I did get another question that says, do you make specific considerations or change your process when translating materials or resources to different French languages? For example, we deal a lot with newcomer, migrant population, example, Creole, Congolese, Algerian, French. We struggle with limited access to good translations in these that are consistent. Unfortunately, we have limited budget to accommodate all these mindfully and sincerely. Is this a case of balancing what we can and cannot do?
Yeah, I definitely think it is. And I think that's where like the partnership would be pretty key, because a lot of community organizations that provide services to newcomer populations do provide legal information, sometimes in a variety of languages. So I think it would be about sort of building partnerships where they could like look at something and let you know if they think that makes sense or not. And then I think it also just kind of goes back to the question of, choosing terms,
Mhm.
um, just kind of keeping in mind like the considerations of if for whatever reason you're not sure that a term is like 100% correct. I mean, the question is according to who, like, so I guess in a situation where it's a language that the law has not been translated into, then you don't have this question of using the official term in the law or not. You're kind of more in a space where you're trying to figure out a term that's going to be accurate based on what the law says and based on what people are familiar with. So I think then it would also be about having an understanding of that community and where they're coming from, because it's not just the language with newcomers, they're coming from a different country where there's a different legal system. There are different laws, and they probably have concepts in mind that aren't the same here. So I think that's an additional consideration in that context to be like, okay, what word is commonly understood, commonly used, but also what does that mean uh, in the country that people are coming from? And are there significant differences in the law here? And what are they? So certainly the terminology is important, but I think also understanding the material differences in the law and focusing on explaining those clearly is probably going to be more important in that situation than knowing whether you got the exact right or best term or not. It's probably more about explaining the concepts, the rules, the rights, the responsibilities as clearly as possible in those other languages.
Mm. Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you, Rebecca. Just two more questions in the Q&A here. Do you know any certified interpretation training for court system?
Well, I know that I shouldn't say I know. I think that it would likely depend on the jurisdiction. Um, and I actually don't have a ton of information about that because the graduate diploma in legal translation, as far as I understand that, that's about translating text
Mhm.
a lot, but obviously interpretation is an important part of translation as well.
Mhm.
So I can see if I can find any resources about interpretation afterwards and send them to you, Hannah,
Mhm. Yeah.
because I don't have any at the moment.
That would be great. And I think that's Doa from St. John Newcomer Center as
Mm,
well. So just as a heads up for the context of that question. Thank you though for the question. Yeah, again, can try to send us a few resources in a follow-up email there. And then yeah, second question here, or more of a sort of a comment with some context. I'd love examples of translation guidelines to share with external translators for the follow-up email. We've had experiences of translators undoing our plain language work, so we're always looking to
mm,
improve our instructions.
hmm. Yeah, so number one, I know that Clio's style guidelines are publicly available on Clio's website. So that's something that's available right now. Our guidelines that we send to translators, it's kind of like a Word document that we've put together and are in the process of revising. It should be ready soon. So I can check with the team and see if that's something that we can share with people who were part of the webinar. But Clio style guidelines are available right now, and I know that they incorporate a lot of plain language concepts, not just like style guidelines can sometimes be more about the details about like
Mhm,
different choices that are being made at the level of style, but Clio's style guidelines really explain clear communication as part of the style guidelines. And
mhm,
the style guidelines that we send to our legal translators do some of that work too, as well.
mhm,
And I think in our case, what ended up in those style guidelines were probably the clear communication issues that we saw repeatedly,
mhm,
because it doesn't cover everything related to clear legal communication. So I would say if you are noticing issues that are coming up repeatedly, it could maybe be worth it to see if Cleo already has an explanation or you yourself have a way of explaining that
mhm,
that you can kind of add to your document. And I think it's up to you whether you want to cover everything exhaustively or if you want to kind of focus on the issues that you see repeatedly that you would really like to highlight and hopefully um, avoid more often.
mhm. Yeah, that's really helpful. I actually just put the link in the chat and also in response to that question there because yeah, it was available online as of recently. I think they updated it as well. So,
Hmm.
but I've made a note of that. And I actually just wanted to, while we have the time here, circle back to the translation in Spanish question we got first, just because I see some really helpful responses in the Q&A actually, just with a few links in case anyone wants to check that out. I'm trying to collect those as well to share afterwards, but there are some helpful responses there with some good referrals there. So thank you for everyone for chiming in on that one. And then, yeah, actually, just another one here from Angela. I'm looking for a program for myself. I already do interpretation and translation as part of my work, but
Mm-hmm.
to have an additional certification apart from my degree in languages. Still good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, like, obviously, the issue with legal translation is I would have said that the US might have more programs since Spanish is more common there, but then the legal concepts are so different in the States that I would sort of question the relevance of those programs. So, yeah, definitely once we start getting away from English and French, that's why I say these things get much more tricky.
Mm-hmm.
And we have only done very small projects so that we can sort of feel like we're maintaining the same quality, clarity, accuracy, all of those things.
Definitely. Okay, that's wonderful. I think we have time for one more question. Let's just see here. Um, I think that this one you answered. Let me just see here. So, um, okay, so you touched on this a little bit, Rebecca, but do you prefer internal translation services to external? What are the pros and cons, which I think you talked about already, but we're using external translators at the moment, but curious of any specific benefits of internal translators in comparison. These services can be very expensive, so we're trying to balance what we can do, but the quality is not always consistent with external trans.
Mm,
Sorry, yeah.
hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say the main benefit of translating in-house is to be able to have staff who has like I create content and I translate content. So when I'm translating content, I still maybe have some of the perspective and the skills and the experience from creating content that is serving me in my translation. And because I am all the time inside our content, our guidelines, things like that, it is much more fluid to kind of like stay within those guidelines. And then to also, because we're all in the same team, we can all contact each other quite easily, then this back and forth about the content, we're able to ask a lot more questions to refine our translation and maybe even encourage the person who created it in a different language to make certain changes in that language based on concerns we have in another one. So all of this is not really possible when we use external translators. We send them it, they send us it back, and we review and fix on our end, and we give them that feedback hopefully for next time, but we're not going back and forth with them. We're just kind of taking what we got and we're going from there on our own.
Mhm.
So those are the benefits. And I mean, yeah, it's definitely tricky. If you didn't hire people for that purpose, then do they necessarily have the training, the experience, the tools they need to do that work internally? Maybe not. So that's kind of maybe what's necessary because we have been translating in-house for a long time and we do hire, like I was hired with that in mind, like for that purpose. So it might be maybe more of a long-term goal in terms of how the organization is hired or how the organization is structured, how the hiring works, to really make that more a part of your process.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you for expanding that a little bit. And I know we're just at time, but we had one really, well, we have two actually questions, but we might need to follow up in an email. But we have just another one I think might be kind of interesting if we have a moment. How about the interpretation confidentiality, especially in small communities? Is there anything to add on that?
That I'm not sure I
Hmm.
understand.
Hmm. Yeah, we can circle back on. I mean,
Okay.
I can actually connect Joe with you because I know there's
Okay.
some cool
Yeah,
questions, so we can address
that would
that.
be good.
Okay, so how about we, I mean, I acknowledge that we are sort of out of time. And I know we probably have some more questions from folks, but we can sort of get to those offline as well. Rebecca, are you comfortable with me sharing your email with folks?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay,
definitely.
wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put it, I didn't want to just blast it out in the chat, but I'm gonna just send that there. I'm also gonna CC Rebecca in my follow-up email in case anyone isn't able to take it down now, but to connect or just to connect with me, and I'm happy to sort of bring those questions forward offline. I wanted to say just a big thank you to Rebecca for your time for the really informative presentation. I know there's lots of questions, and that conversation will continue. I'm sure. And finally, I do want to say a big thanks to everyone who took the time to join us today. The recording again is going to get uploaded. I'm going to share that. I'm going to share some of these links as well that were circulated today that Rebecca brought up in the presentation. And if again, any questions, comments, just let me know. Reach out to me. Rebecca will be accessible as well with her with their expertise and knowledge on this topic, so we can kind of move the conversation along as we kind of go along. So thank you so much, everyone. Again, thank you for your comments and your questions, and have a lovely rest of your week. And we'll see you for more programming in the new year. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for organizing.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.